Yeah. We're wondering first. I don't think an alternate's coming.
Yeah, I think that's that, but we should be good. Ash, you ready?
Yep.
Orlando, you ready?
Ready.
Yours ready? All right, let's get this show on. Good evening, everyone. My name is Aaron Tuckfield. I'm the chairman of the Macomb Township Zoning Board of Appeals. Tonight is September the 8th. This is a special meeting that I am calling to order. With that, we're going to move on to the second item of our agenda this evening, which is the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand with me for the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Very good. The next item on our agenda is roll call. Ms. Lawson, please call the roll.
Absolutely. Starting with Member DeCoster.
Here.
Member Piper.
Here.
Chairman Tuckfield.
Here.
Member Slauson is here. Is absent, and I do believe that he had indicated before this meeting that he was not able to make it.
And Mr. Fox, I should remember our bylaws on this. We don't excuse on the ZBA. It's just noted that. Correct. You had properly notified. Okay. Very good. And for the record, we do have a quorum this evening. We do not have either of our alternates here. It is just 4 regular board members. I think I'll address with that when we get into the items. The next item is item 4, to address any conflicts of interest. At this time, I'm going to have the secretary call the roll, and when she does, she'll be asking if we have a conflict of interest. If anyone has a conflict of interest, please answer yes on if there's a conflict on any items, and no if there are none. Ms. Lawson, please call the roll.
Okay, starting with myself, no. Chairman Tuckfield.
No.
Member Piper.
No.
Member DeCoster.
No.
Right. Having completed item 4, we're going to move on to item 5, which is the approval of tonight's agenda. Are there any motions to approve?
I'll make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Support.
Motion by Mr. Piper. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
All opposed by saying nay. That motion carries. I will say I didn't quite get to your name.
So it doesn't count.
Hopefully it buys me some points. Next is the approval of the previous meeting minutes. Are there any motions here?
We don't
have any because
we didn't get our minutes.
As I'm reading, I'm like, we didn't have the minutes from the regular one. So with that said, I'm going to skip item 6. We will deal with those at our regularly scheduled October meeting. Item 7 is old business, which I don't believe we have any this evening. Motion moves assigned to item 8, new business. Before I get into the items this evening, I just wanted to make a note for the record that since we have an even number of members here this evening, any items that we vote on, if a motion results in a tie, that motion is considered defeated. So even if there was an affirmative motion for something and it ends up in a 2-2 vote, that motion is defeated and goes down. So typically what we do when we have less than an even number or less than an odd number is before a vote, I typically will give the applicant, which I think we have some applicants here or an applicant here tonight, the ability to table the item if they so choose to another meeting. I'll bring that up at the point that we go to a vote for the applicant, but just wanted to give you a heads up on that procedurally. With that said, item 8A is an interpretation of the zoning ordinance, a little bit out of the ordinary for our normal bread and butter. This would be section 10.0354, a request for an interpretation to consider a ground-mounted solar array as similar exterior equipment. This is on permanent parcel 0, or technically this definition would be because of permanent parcel 0824476-007. Mr. Box, could you take us through this, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman and Board. So the property in question that raised this issue is on the screen behind you, and I'm sure you got it in your packet as well. So the first thing we want to do is get an interpretation. So there are 2 items. Depending on what your interpretation is tonight on item 8A, we may not need to do item 8B. Variance may not even need to be necessary. So They are seeking to put a solar panel. Our ordinance is very silent to solar panels. We do have a few in the township that are on roofs of houses, but this is a ground mounted one. And to my knowledge, this would be the first one in the township. Right now, I think the building official determined that it would be an accessory structure, an accessory use, which they already have a couple accessory structures on the property. It would need to be, they would need a variance for it. That being said, there was some question about whether this is actually could be considered outdoor equipment, similar to air conditioners or pool pumps, things of that nature. That being said, I think you've all probably read the ordinance, but the key phrase in there, I think, is that it's similar exterior equipment. Is a solar panel similar outdoor equipment to water pumps, pool filters, heaters, air conditioning units, or the like. And if that is the case, it typically would be required to be behind the rear wall of the structure, but the building official at that point would have the authority to allow them to put it in side yards. I'm sure you've all driven around and seen some air conditioners that aren't behind the house, but are actually on the side yard. There are instances where they just can't be located back there, and he has the authority to allow that. So if this is deemed a similar structure where they're seeking to put it, which you can see here on this slide, it would be considered their side yard. The building official would have the authority to allow that. And in speaking with Mr. Maples, I think that is the case. If it's deemed to be similar use or similar to a air conditioner or pool heater or the like, I think he would allow that to be in the side yard. Otherwise, it's not allowed there, and they're going to need a variance. So I guess I can answer any questions, but that's the gist of the first agenda item. And I know I will comment, Mr. Tuckfield, you did point out there's also section 10.0336, which is satellite receivers and dish antennas. Kind of a similar situation. You could also consider it one of those items, but the ordinance itself doesn't really address solar panels. So much like many other things we've experienced, there was no mention of roundabouts. So how did we treat them? And I'm sure a few years from now, we'll be trying to figure out how do we address items that relate to electric vehicles. And it's just not something that was in the ordinance at this time.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Box. Any questions for Mr. Box from the board? Mr. Orlando, I did actually have a couple of questions for you procedurally. My apologies, I didn't get here early enough to ask you them before the meeting. With the definition request, what are our requirements as far as public hearing and things of that nature? Obviously, I would think it'd be courtesy to have the petitioner or the applicant, I suppose, in this case, speak on this request. I don't know if it's required, but what requirements do we have as far as form and function here?
I don't believe that there's need for a public hearing on this particular issue, because it's up to the board to make the decision as to whether or not they interpret the ordinance to include this solar panel.
Okay. And then my second question is, Mr. Box mentioned, I was reading through other portions of the ordinance that I'm familiar with that could potentially be pertinent. How narrow is our guidelines here tonight? Are we required to only look at the definition and specifically the ordinance that is placed in front of us? Do we have any leeway if we think there might be other pertinent pieces of the ordinance? What are our requirements?
I believe you're limited to the section that's been applied for in the application.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Orlando. All right. Any other questions before we go to the applicant? Hearing none, if the applicants and any of the representatives would like to come up, state your name and address for the record, and give any comments on this you might have. And go ahead, and if you could. Okay, just careful with the step. We've had people trip on it before.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just bear in mind for the applicant, we're going to try to take this in two sections. So first one is going to be with regards to the definition. And there might be additional comments that you might have if we say agree on the definition. But if you could, for form's sake, we're going to be talking about the definition first. So bear that in mind with any comments you might have.
My name is Jason Cooley, I'm the president of Quality Solar, 701 West St. John, Michigan. Yeah, I'm at Arnold Salem at 49285 Fairchild Road. It sounds like the first point of the conversation is what is a solar array by definition in regards to what the township zoning ordinance says is allowed from the exterior equipment standpoint.
Specifically, we would consider this a definition request, and it's whether or not a solar panel can be considered as the specific word would be similar exterior equipment to the pool pump type activity.
And I noticed generator was listed in that, I believe.
I believe it is, yes.
As a function, a solar array behaves like a generator. It produces power, it supplements the home. It does it differently. It doesn't use fossil fuel sources. It's just the sun. The utility, in fact, categorizes solar arrays as generators. When we file for interconnection with the utility grid, it doesn't necessarily limit it to solar. You could have a wind generator or a large, fossil fuel power generator. That falls all under the utilities guideline as a generator for interconnection. So, solar, I mean, in and of itself is a generator.
Is that? I don't want to cut you off. Was that okay? Very good. Any questions from the board to the applicant or his representative?
The only thing I noticed that it's behind the neighbor's house. Does the neighbor have any issues with this being back there?
The neighbors I talked to didn't say anything. One property line is just to the north of the site that they didn't hear one way or another. And the one that's just east of it, they didn't voice objection either.
I would like to add that Mr. Stabile was going to put his own stipulation, maybe granted this variance, and provide screening, vegetative screening on the north and eastern side of that array. If you look at our third sheet, I've highlighted how that would go if you look at your satellite.
Mr. Box, and I'm used to having to go to the public at this point. We have no public, so we wouldn't need to go to them anyway. But the applicant mentioned generators. Do we have generators defined elsewhere in the ordinance they were on? I'm trying to get it searched on here, but I wasn't sure if you were already.
That's a good question. Let me give me a second here and I can see if I can pull that up in my hard copy. We do not.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
I don't have much. I mean, hearing it, I'm not against solar. I support it. I don't see how it correlates between the items that are listed under the ordinance. To me, these items are items that typically talk more against the house. It seems to be outside of that, in my opinion. So I'm not sure if I would support this.
Yeah, I guess my concern here would be that if we look at the intent of the ordinance, I think the intent of the ordinance is speaking to smaller footprints. Even if we look at generator, And that was, if I look elsewhere to try to understand what it's defined as, that would seem like it is consistent elsewhere, that if it was a bigger item, it tends to refer to it differently.
This structure is, I think, what we say, 3812. It's obviously a significantly larger structure.
I guess one of the questions, and this might be to Mr. Orlando. Obviously, we have the definition in front of us. We also have a site plan essentially, and it's probably hard to think of the definition without thinking of the site plan.
I think you need to, though.
Okay, so I was going to say, because to me, the size makes a difference, but do we consider the size with regards to the definition?
No, I think you have to consider the definition based on.
Does the definition apply to this application?
Exactly. And then if you move to step B, then you decide whether or not it's a variance that should be granted.
And if I could, Mr. Tuckfield,
Mr. Box.
point out, you had mentioned the satellite dish and such, a different place in the ordinance. That section gave specific sizes. If it's bigger than a certain size, it didn't meet that category, required a variance. The outdoor equipment does not mention size. It's just the type of equipment.
But it does say similar.
Correct.
But, and I guess, if you were to, I guess similar is the word that we're considering tonight. So on my part, I don't consider from a layman's perspective a 38 by 12 solar panel array is similar to a pump or even a generator, which would typically be an appliance on the side of the house. So obviously we haven't gotten to a vote. I guess that would be my feeling. Any other comments from the board?
I have actually a question, because this has kind of come up and it might be a problem coming before us again. Is there anything in the works as far as changing the ordinance and including some pitch that would alleviate
this? So we are obviously in the process of updating the zoning ordinance right now, as you guys are aware. And this is something we have talked about. And I think one of the things that we have discussed internally was we wanted to see your opinion on this tonight to formulate how we're going to interpret it moving forward. I think generally there's no health or safety or welfare concerns with a solar panel. It's not, in that sense, it's not going to injure, no one's going to get electrocuted, or there's no danger in that being there. So I think staff internally has really no health or safety. There's no real objections here other than the ordinance is silence to it. So can they actually put it there or not?
Reading this sentence again, it says central air conditioning units and other exterior equipment such as, but not limited to, pool filters, heaters, generators, heat pumps, and water pumps shall be located within the rear yard or behind the rear wall of the principal structure. And then it says, in a case where non-financial practical difficulty occurs, it may be located in the side yard. I have the same, when I say that, similar exterior equipment. One I'm reading online might be wording slightly differently than the portion we have.
That's kind of happy the word. Oh, that's gonna be word for word, but
Do we know if it's not the parts here too much, Mr. Box, but on our agenda, we have similar exterior equipment, and on the web version, it says other exterior equipment. Do you know which one is accurate?
It's other exterior equipment. According to my copy that I'm reading, the hard copy.
The similar exterior equipment is in the title, not in the ordinance itself.
And this would apply, this particular provision, is this within our residential? Or is this a general density that might potentially cover industrial or commercial, for example?
This is in the general provisions.
So technically this would apply to our industrial and commercial
All zones, correct.
zones. Which obviously industrial and commercial air conditioners and generators are also of a different scale than what I might picture in a residential area. Okay, any other questions or thoughts from the board? If not, to the applicant, probably going to go toward a vote. And as I mentioned earlier, a tie is essentially a no. So we try to give you the courtesy that something you want us to proceed toward a vote on.
May I add one more public comment?
Absolutely.
Typically, solar arrays, in our experience, then all across the state are considered and zoned as accessory structures. And in cases where jurisdictions do have specific, solar zoning amendments or sections, this is just for consideration because it sounds like the township is looking to add that language. They just listed out as requirements of an accessory structure. We've got to hit our setbacks. There are minimum lot sizes. We fully understand that we want giant solar arrays cluttering up small residential lots. So there are lot size requirements, and then there's a coverage percentage requirement. All of those things, again, and I'm sure you've seen this across the state. All of those requirements are met in this case. It's a very small percentage of the lot coverage. Mr. Sable has a large lot, so I'm just encouraging you to get that consideration if we're already thinking of adding that language.
And I'd appreciate it, and this just goes back to what I asked Mr. Orlando earlier, is how narrowly we have to look at this particular request. I would say outside of this request, I would think that definition would be more clearly similar to me, certainly than what we're looking at the moment. But if you would like us to proceed forward with a vote, I will then bring it back to the board unless you had any other comments. Give you guys one chance. Okay. Bring it back to the board for any comments, questions, or motions.
So I actually do have a question. When he made the comment about it being an accessory structure, there are already accessory structures on the property currently, correct?
Correct.
So if this was to be an accessory structure, would he then be over the allowed amount that he?
Correct. You would need a different.
Kind of not, he'd either have to remove something, there'd have to be a change.
But it would be a different request. So
A different request.
Okay, I just wanted clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you.
yes. If there's no other comments or questions or motions, I can make a motion. I don't do it very often, but I can. I would make a motion. Actually, I should ask Mr. Orlando. So I'm making a motion on a definition, I would say, to state that we find that this is defined as, or how would be appropriate to word this?
Well, I think you go by the agenda item. So you're being asked to interpret whether a ground mounted solar array, and I think it should be an other exterior equipment, as that's what's specifically defined in the ordinance.
Okay. Then I would make a motion to provide the interpretation for other exterior equipment relative to the proposed ground mounted solar array, that the ground mounted solar array does not meet the definition in my opinion, after reading and considering the text of the ordinance. Support. Motion by Tuckfield, supported by DeCoster. Ms. Lawson, please call the roll.
Starting with Chairman Tuckfield,
Yes.
Member DeCoster,
Yes.
Member Piper.
No.
And Member Lawson, no.
Well, that's always the double negative, in which case the yes motion failed. Mr. Orlando?
That's correct.
We've had one motion. Since the affirmative motion failed and it was no, that would indicate no. Are we to proceed without another motion, or do I ask for any further motions that might be the case?
No, I think you've made a determination. I mean, you've got a tie vote, which means that the definition doesn't meet the ordinance.
Okay. Very good.
Well, just to clarify, if the motion was that it does not meet the ordinance, and as he stated,
I was saying it's a double negative.
double 2-2 vote means the motion is defeated. Does that mean therefore the definition does allow for solar? Or do they need to vote in that manner?
And then have that fail if it was going to fail by a tie?
I think perhaps we could have a clearer motion. Makes it easier for us to understand what is actually being asked. I think what you're looking for is does a ground mounted solar array fall within the definition of other exterior equipment?
So if I was to say my motion was to find that a ground mounted solar array does not fall under the definition of other exterior equipment?
Correct.
Okay. And if we make that motion, we come out with the same result, you would conclude that that had failed and then we would move on?
Correct.
Okay, well then I will make a motion to find that I do not consider the ground mounted solar array. I better write this down because I'm already doing this incorrectly. Can you give it to me one more time, Mr. Orlando? Make sure I've got this worded right.
The motion is to find that a ground mounted solar array within the scope of section 10.0354.
Thank you. Make one motion on the ZBA in the last 2 years and I managed to make it work well. All right, well then I will make a motion to find that the ground mounted solar array does not fall within the definition of other exterior equipment within the scope of section 10.0354 based upon reading of the ordinance and looking into the intent of the ordinance as I have read it. Support. Motion by Mr. Tuckfield, supported by Mr. Coster. Ms. Lawson, please call the roll.
Okay, starting with Chairman Tuckfield,
Yes.
Member DeCoster,
Yes.
Member Piper.
No.
Member Slauson is no.
All right. Motion fails. And we then close out the item. We move on to the next item, which I believe the next item then is no, because we
Correct.
find that within the definition. I believe completes both of our items for this evening. That takes us on to item 9, public comments. Are there any public comments? I believe you're the only public here this evening. If you have any comments, your name and address are on the records. They're already there, but please feel free to have any comments that you have at this time.
What would be a follow-up step for us if there is a, perhaps, deciding whether are we just finished with this?
Mr. Box is going to be the appropriate person to answer that.
I think by their determination that this is not considered outdoor equipment or exterior equipment, much like you indicated, other places considered accessory structure. So it would then be considered an accessory structure. So you can look at our ordinance and see the rules for accessory structures, which I think looking at the aerial, it looks like you already have a couple. I think based on your lot size, you're limited to 2, and it looks like you already have 2. So you can seek a variance for an additional accessory structure or remove an accessory structure that currently exists in order to allow for this one.
So that would be an avenue that we can travel. Is a solar array by the township's ordinance definition? Sounds like it's undefined at the moment, right? So
Correct.
would that fall under the classification of an accessory structure?
That would probably up to these folks.
I would assume that we do not have the ability to answer that question, I shall say, on the fly.
That's correct.
Okay.
Is there a possibility of consideration for an amendment to add solar arrays to that section where the outdoor equipment was listed?
So that is a process that usually starts with the planning department. It would have to go from the planning department to the planning commission, which I sit upon. The planning commission then makes a recommendation to the board of trustees. The board of trustees would have to put it on their agenda and then they would have to vote on it. I am one vote on a 7-member planning commission, but I would say that I don't like myself, and I mentioned this planning commission briefly the other night in advance of this meeting. I don't like that we have a scenario that's not covered in the ordinance. That's generally not great. And for myself, and only myself, I am roughly in support of the idea of defining a solar panel as an accessory structure. It makes sense to me reading the totality of the ordinance. More of it to be done, but I would certainly be in support of asking Mr. Box to look into doing that. Obviously, there's a time period to that. I certainly couldn't guarantee what the vote would be. One vote, and all I can do is make a recommendation if the board votes with me. So, but that would be my opinion for what it's worth.
I just want to find a question from me. Say we're back here asking for variance for just an additional accessory structure. We have to wait for the definition of solar, or are we kind of all agree with that? We can consider this an accessory structure and proceed that way.
I would defer to Mr. Orlando, but I believe what Mr. Orlando told us is that we would have to probably do another definition for a accessory structure.
Right. It would have to come back for another interpretation similar to this one.
I believe elsewhere in the ordinance, the portion that I referenced to Mr. Box refers to satellite dishes over 3.5 feet in diameter are referred to as accessory structures, which was the most similar place I could find in the ordinance to reference anything similar to this. So
if that's the case, if you came back for an accessory structure variant or definition interpretation, you'd also need a variance to have an additional accessory structure on the property. Correct. I agree with Chairman Tuckfield. I didn't, again, I apologize, we didn't go your way, but I didn't see it defined under this ordinance. I definitely looked at it more of an accessory structure myself, but that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, and this gets back to our role isn't generally to vote on what we would prefer. Let's try to understand the interpretation of it. So all that said, if that closes out public comments, we will move on to ZBA member comments. Are there any comments this evening?
I'd like to mention that our fireman, Joe Warren, started his walk today. I had the privilege to do a small portion of his walk with him this morning. And I have a good appreciation for what he's going through because I did 12 miles and I was dressed in exercise clothes and I was tired at the end of 12 miles. And I think he was doing 40 miles today alone.
What speed was he walking?
They were going at a very slow pace, actually. They weren't going that fast. They had escorts, pretty much all the way through, at least as far as Jimmy John's Field. That's as far as I walked with him. But it was funny because the crowd was very large when they started. By the time they hit Garfield, most of them were gone. But I would encourage anybody to support him. He's doing wonderful work for the firemen.
And for those of us who walk around the township, Mr. Piper is one of them. You can see Mr. Warren preparing for this walk for a long time. He walks around with a weighted vest. He does a lot of work for the residents here, residents and representative. Mr. Warren is a local firefighter who does a walk to the west side of the state every year in full firefighting gear to raise money for a Fighters for Cancer charity.
140 miles in roughly 3 days.
Long way with a lot of weight. So
I had one other thing. I'm with Friends of Macomb Township. We do bottle and can drives for Glen Peters School for handicapped kids on Heidenreich and 21 Mile. On the 18th of this month is probably our last one for this season, unless something changes. But we will be doing one more from 11 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. All the proceeds. It's an all volunteer organization, so all the proceeds go right to the community. So we also give scholarships to seniors. We gave 8 of $1,000 scholarships out this year to Macomb Township students for their freshman year of college. Yeah.
Good for you guys. All right. Anyone else? Hearing none, I will move on to planning director comments. Mr. Box?
None this evening.
All right. Mr. Orlando, anything?
No, sir.
Good. Move on to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn? Moved by Ms. Lawson and
Or
supported by Mr. Piper. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed by saying nay. At 7:05, we stand adjourned.